Okay.
All right. So everyone get in. There's seats right here if you want to come in and sit down.
Oh
It's
no.
echoing.
Is that my? It's my computer. I bet.
Oh, it's your computer. Rosie.
Shame. Shaming myself.
Even better. I thought it was the other one. Just hit the mute.
Yeah.
Did you do it?
No. It won't let me do it while I'm sharing.
Let's say hi. Come on. Hi.
Can I say? Oh yeah,
So
nice.
hi. How many engineers does it take to mute?
Yeah.
All right. Did we do it?
No.
No. My mic is on. My mic is on probably. Hold on. Sorry guys. Sorry. We're trying to all these stuff down. So we're experiencing some fun. Yep. Yep. Yay, 3 minutes of the bus. All right. Thank you all for coming. This is Denver Modern Web. This is our 1-year anniversary. Yeah. So first of all, thank you all. If this is your first time or this is your 13th time, thank you so much for supporting this meetup. We've put a lot of time and effort in trying to get this off the ground, and we're just so excited to have this big of a turnout tonight and just having you guys come out and support us. So thank you all. This has been a great journey for, I know, myself, my co-founders, Ricky and Sig over there. So again, thank you so much. So for just some quick announcements, just get some stuff out of the way. Thank you to Salm. That's the company that myself, Ricky and Sig work for, and Rosie as well, for getting us the space, pizza, beer. This couldn't happen without them. So shout out to them. If you have any questions of what we do at Salm, just come grab one of us afterwards. Happy to explain what we do here at Salm. For next time, we're going to be doing your own innocence. Own your innocence. Own your innocence. Sorry. This is going to be a talk by Jesse, one of our solution principals here. This is going to be on monitoring a microservices architecture to make sure that all your services are healthy and how to maintain a large microservice ecosystem. After that, our very own Sig is going to be giving a talk on backend APIs and development and some of the best practices, do's and don'ts when creating backend APIs. So it is Python. Yes, in Python. So I feel like everything's in Python these days. But anyway, so again, thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, you can reach out to Rosie afterwards or myself, and we'll just be hanging out. So appreciate you all coming. Rosie, take it away.
Excellent. Awesome. So tonight we are going to be talking about React hooks. I don't know if anyone has gotten a chance to poke around in this documentation yet. Show of hands. That's sweet. So hooks were introduced at ReactConf 2018 as an RFC. They have since gone through that process and they've been approved. And as of the most recent stable release of React, they are available for use. So that's pretty exciting. So before we dive into what hooks are, I think it's important to discuss what led hooks to being made available. And that is, for a while, the only way that we could access state in our React applications were through class components. That was the simplest stateful primitive that React offered. And it was kind of bulky. So anytime you wanted to have state in your app, you had to create a constructor, create your state object. If you wanted to instantiate some, or anytime you wanted to use lifecycle components, you had to initiate them in component mount, and then in a separate lifecycle hook, you would remove it. And there was a lot of cleanup work involved. And the core issue with it was that it made it really difficult to share stateful logic across our components. So a couple patterns emerged for people to try and solve this issue of sharing state across components. One of them was higher order components, and another was render props. So higher order components, that was the one where you'd take a component and then you'd do things to it and you'd return a new component that had kind of been emboldened with state. So here we are we're fetching the user data, and then we're passing it into the component. And you can see it, how you would use it. And then with render props, that one actually you would have another component, and it would take a function rather than, it would have a function that would return an element rather than having its own logic. And an example of that was commonly used is the context API. If you've ever worked with that, that's a render props implementation. And so both of these work. Oh yeah, see, I'm here to tell you why you shouldn't use these and you should be using hooks, but like a couple months ago, I was here talking about how render props was the coolest thing and you had to use it. So both of these patterns allow us to reuse stateful code, which is cool, but they require you to restructure your app anytime you want to use them, and it makes it really difficult to follow how the data is flowing through your apps. And very quickly, you find yourself in what some developers have coined wrapper hell. Enter hooks. So React hooks, they let us use stateful logic without having to change the component hierarchy for our apps. So what is a hook? A hook is a function provided by React that lets you hook into React features, and you can use them in function components. Those are, I think there's like 3 key pieces there that we're going to dig into. 1, it's just a function. 2, it lets you use React features that you're already using today. And 3, you don't have to use class components anymore. So 1, a hook is a function. Here we can see use state, that function that we're pulling in. That is one of the core hooks that React provides. And you can see that to use it, you just call it, and you can pass in one parameter that functions as your initial state. So it's a pretty simple implementation. We get all the benefits of pure functions. They're reusable, they're composable, they're easy to isolate, and they're easy to test. So that's great. Additionally, hooks let you hook into React features. One of the counterintuitive things, like everyone was making a really big fuss about hooks coming out, it doesn't actually really introduce that many new features to React. What it does is it creates a simpler API for you to tap into the features that you've already been using. So it exposes features we already know and love, like state and context and our lifecycle hooks. And then the third one, now rather than having this bulky function component, which has a lot of boilerplate code, it can lead to weird bugs when you have your duplicated code across the lifecycle methods. So for example, if you, let's say you make a call to fetch data when your component mounts, but then your state is changing, and so then you have to put a call in your component did update. That way you're comparing your old prop with your new prop, and if they change, then you have to do another call to fetch fresh data. And if you forget to do that, then your app can get out of sync. Your state will have updated, but your component won't know. And also, the way, like having to use the lifecycle methods like this, it breaks up logic into just the state that it's in the lifecycle, not actually the function that that code is providing. So we can see, oh, I thought that I was gonna, like in this example, we're setting the interval here and then we're clearing it here. It'd be really nice if there was some way that that logic could be kept together. So goodbye, class components. We don't need you. But it should be noted that you can continue to use class components even if you decide to use hooks. Everything that React is introducing moving forward, they're making 100% backwards compatible. So you can use hooks in a couple small components and just see how you feel about it, and you don't have to refactor your pre-existing code. One point to note with it is that you cannot use hooks inside of class components. So it's one or the other. So this is what I was going to show is with a class component versus with hooks. And here you see you get the coupling based on the relatedness of the code. So you're setting the timeout in the same place that you're clearing it, and that makes it really easy for someone who's coming in. They don't have to be trying to trace down everything. So let's look at some of the hooks that React provides. The first, and probably the one that you're going to use the most, is useState. It accepts an initial state as its only argument, and then it returns a set. It'll return your current state, and then it'll give you a function for updating the state. So this is what it looks like when it's implemented. You can use array destructuring to just grab each of the return items. And the cool thing about it is you can use it as many times as you want. So if I wanted to create a count, but then I wanted to set a variable for a name, and then I wanted to set a variable for the last name, you can just keep adding them. And React is keeping track of which state is which by the order that they're being rendered. And it knows that when it's re-rendering, that component isn't going to have changed the order that those states are being declared. So it keeps track of it that way. The next one is useEffect, and that's where we're going to be tapping into the same lifecycle hooks that lifecycle methods were providing for us. So it lets us perform side effects in function components. So that would be, we created our count, right? And then when you click a button, you want to set the count to increase. And so your effect will handle that. useEffect can be good for fetching data, setting up subscriptions, and manually updating the DOM. And so by default, useEffect will run after every render, but it does give you options there that we will dive into. So it can also be used to deal with side effects that require cleanup, like your timeouts. So here we see, because we're returning a function, basically you can use an effect, and then if you have it return a function, it'll run that every time. And so it's cleaning up after itself as it goes. And then it also does it when the component unmounts. And kind of going back to the same benefits I was talking about before, it helps us group logic by relatedness. But wait, we're re-rendering after every single, or we're cleaning up after every render. Feels kind of excessive. You're right. So it does offer, you can pass in an optional second argument, which is if you see that array with the date in it, and that says only run this cleanup function if the date variable has changed, or if the date state has changed. So otherwise, it'll just ignore it. Another really cool hook, this is my favorite hook that has been introduced, is useReducer. And has anyone here worked with Redux before? So you can use your reducer pattern that you use in Redux with hooks to manage your state. So if you're, like the example that I have here is for like a slideshow. If you have your state that's managing multiple variables, you're keeping track of isPlaying and you're keeping track of the index, you can have, by calling dispatch, if you pass in the type, you can be updating like multiple states with just that one call. And it keeps all of your code for that slideshow together in one function. So it's really neat. It's an alternate option to use state, helps us co-locate, and it's great for when you have lots of sub-values that you're keeping track of. Finally, if you are unsatisfied, not fully satisfied with the hooks that React has offered for you, you can create your own, which is pretty sweet. So here is an example of one custom hook you could make. You're passing in the initial state, and your hook is then using the useState hook, and it's creating its own record of that within the hook. It's running the update, and then it's passing back the updated state and the toggler, and the updater function. So when you actually use that in your app, you would just pull in the useToggle hook from a different file, and then you can call it suseToggle. So there are a couple rules around it. Or it's a function that returns the updated state. Great for reusing your logic. The one hook, or the one rule with custom hooks, is that you always have to start it with use, and that is so that it's one so that so the other developers on your team can know, oh, this is a component that's like has state incorporated into it, and they can be mindful of that. But then also, React has created a linter that can, or has created a plugin that can lint your code for the rules that are necessary for following React, or for hooks that I'll go into. And if you don't use on your custom hooks, it won't know, and so it won't lint them. And then, yeah, so the benefit of that, they're just functions, so we can extract them out and use them wherever, which is really neat. Just something to keep in mind, you're not actually sharing the state. The hooks are just a mechanism for running that stateful logic, so something to keep in mind. There are a couple rules for using hooks. You can only use hooks at the top level of your function, so you can't run them in a conditional. You can't be like, if this, then make this state call, or initialize the state. And Ryan Florence, he's one of the guys behind React Router, he had a really funny, corny way of remembering this rule, which is that you really love hooks. One might even say that you love them unconditionally. So, no conditions. The other rule is just that you can't call them from regular JavaScript. It has to be through React functions, or React function components, or custom hooks. And as I mentioned before, they have a plugin for enforcing this. So it's kind of nice, because as I was going through it, I was inadvertently using hooks in incorrect ways, and it called me out, so that was neat. So now I have a demo for us to kind of go through and look at what this looks like in the editor. I drew inspiration for demonstrating the power of hooks. I drew inspiration from a character who also draws a lot of power from a hook, and that is Maui from Moana. Has anyone here seen Moana? Couple parents in the room. For those who don't know Maui, I have a TLDR. He's a demigod. He has a magical hook that lets him shapeshift. Desperate for validation from humans. This, you guys can just kind of read this. The backstory is basically like his parents were humans and they just abandoned him, and so now he's desperate for human affection, and that, or for human validation, and that plays into the purpose of my app, so that's why I give you that backstory. All right, so this is Maui's kudos board. He created it so that humans could leave reviews thanking him for all of the good things that he's done for them. So you can leave a review, and it'll, depending on what star you give, so let's say I give a 4-star review. He captured the sun for us. It'll add it to the list. And then once it gets to it, this is just cycling through. You can see based on the rating, 4, he's like, okay, that's pretty good. He's like reacting positively. 5, he's dancing really happy because he's really excited. 3, he's kind of nervous because that's not that good of a review. Oh, I made my 1 go away. He yells a lot if you leave a 1-star review. Let's see. Yeah, he's not pleased about that. He's upset. All right, so let's dig in to see what's happening here. So this setup right now is just using the class component. So you can see here we're pulling in the class. We're setting our state object. In our component did mount, we set the interval. We have to clear the interval on the unmount, otherwise you run into, yeah? Yeah, definitely. Is that good? More?
One more?
Too far. That one. Neat. Okay. Close this. So we're setting the interval. This is what's going through. The current index is what's being used to decide which one of these is displaying. So we're setting that in our state, and we're calling this .setState. That's the class way of setting the state. And yeah, and so in order to switch this to hooks, it's pretty simple, actually. I'm going to make this be over here. So now we can see what's changed. We're pulling in useState and useEffect, because those are the hooks that we'll need to accomplish what we were doing. We are setting 2 state values right here. And then rather than having to do this .state reviews or this .state current index, you can just call it by current index, because it's been defined as such. And then in our useEffect, you can see we've set up the timeout, and then we have our cleanup function to remove the timeout. And then we're saying the things that it should be aware of for running this effect are the current index and reviews. So if new reviews are being added, it should run it should update, basically. One thing that I found was an interesting gotcha, and is something to keep in mind, is you'll see here, in the earlier example, we were actually doing a set interval, and now we're doing set timeout. And it's still working, because the way that it works is that it sets the timeout, but then as soon as it updates it, it's running it again. So it's setting the new timeout, and it's clearing its first timeout. So it's kind of just constantly setting a timeout and clearing it, which the internet told me was not actually that big of a performance issue. If you would prefer to use set interval, so the reason that I didn't use set interval originally was that there were weird side effects to it, where either if you put in a cleanup function, it would immediately clean it out, and so it would only run once. But if you didn't put in a cleanup function, then it would run every time, and so then you had like increasing set intervals, and it led to this really interesting effect. So Dan Abramov has spoken to it. Apparently a lot of people were calling them out, being like, this is a reason why hooks are not good. And he has an article here that maybe I'll post to the meetup post if you're interested in reading more. But he's created a hook that you can pull in that is a set interval. And they use refs for that. It's a really interesting solution, so I recommend reading it. But that's really all that you have to do to update to using hooks. It's very simple. So I have a couple other examples of how you could build on this with your hooks. So here, we've added, I have to run it. So now we have a couple toggles in here, so we can, if he wants to like pause it and really read into one of those reviews because he's not sure about it, He can pause on it or keep playing it. It'll start going again. And then also up here we have hide feed, display feed. And both of those, if you look at it, are basically doing the same code. You're setting the state, and then you're just creating a little function that's taking your update function and switching the value here. And so that seems like a great candidate. In fact, I already showed you guys the solution earlier in the slideshow for a custom hook. So if we go here, we can see what that would look like to implement a custom hook. Here I have this use toggle function, exactly what we saw before. And to use it, you just import that into your app, and then down here, you just call it, and you pass. So here I'm actually, the update function is going to call this use toggle, so I switched the name of it from set feed visible to toggle feed visible because that's what the update function is now doing. So that's kind of a neat little thing you can do with it. And then additionally, if we want to see reducer in action, now let's say for our app, we want to have the feed be such that you can also scroll through it. And you want to have it be just clickable. It's not going to move on its own. You can go back and forth. So to implement that with useReducer, you can set up this nifty setup here where you're passing in your state, and then depending on what type is called, you're updating the state accordingly. So if we're just going next, then we, if the feed is playing, continue playing. If for next, I decided that that should pause it. So that line actually pauses it if you're on next. And then it just increments the current index, decrements it, and toggles it. And here we're passing in, this is the initial state that you're passing in to your reducer. And it works as expected.
Are these typically pretty small, or are you building out? Are these ones that have been like really fleshed out and built upon? Because everything I'm seeing here is really small, but I've seen React Hooks before being kind of.
I think part of their thought process with it is that you can keep it pretty small. Yeah. Like it's kind of a benefit to keeping it small and breaking things down into as small of pieces of logic as you can, and then just composing them. Do you mean which part is small? Like the
size of it, like just going through, like they all seem pretty small, so I was just curious if there's
like this here.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, you could definitely. So I think one use case for a custom hook that has come up in my mind as something that would be great to use is like in our Redux applications, we are often trying to like fetch data from the server, and so you could have a hook that's basically accomplishing that rather than a higher order component that's doing the same thing. I mean, that still wouldn't be that big of a function. I don't know. You could make it as long as you want, or you could put as much functionality into it as you would like. Yeah, I kind of stuck to more simple examples, but. Does anyone have any questions about using hooks? Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question. So if you wanted to fetch data sort of when it mounts, can you use effect to accomplish that? And if so, would you have to when the data comes back to the API, would you have to have a custom setter and then only have the effect sort of get called when the then set variable changes, which would effectively be a complete did mount, or do you need to actually bring in one mount lifecycle hook?
So Well, your effects by default run after every render, and that includes component did mount. So, and it runs after a component did or will unmount.
It was component did mount, component will update, and then component will unmount, right?
Well, so I spoke to those because those are the lifecycle hooks that we are familiar with class components. But what happens with useEffect is it's running after every render. And so then you can have it so it won't change by passing in that extra parameter, and you're saying unless this state updates, don't do anything. But yeah, so by default it will run, and then if your state updates for some reason, like if you somewhere else in the app, if you fetch data and it changes that data in your store, then that would register as that state item having changed, and so then it would run your effect. Yeah.
I saw in your app, I saw you were using the 2 instances of use state.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you can, I just figured.
Yeah.
Now.
No, so you can use it as many times as you want, which is like you could have, that's here, I actually, when I was starting to build it, I had like 5 instances of use state, and then that was what prompted me to be like, oh, this would be actually a good use case for useReducer because these states are all related, and so you can actually put them within the same function there. But you can use state as many times as you want, and you can use useEffect as many times as you want, and the way that React is keeping track of it is by the order that you're rendering it the first time. Like, you're not going to be updating your component. You're not like going into prod and updating how you're setting up your component. Like, usually the order that you're setting your state variables is going to stay the same between renders, and that's how it keeps track of it. Yeah.
Can you make API calls in the useReducer function?
I don't know that you would want to, because I think useReducer is primarily, it's like when you're setting the state. So you're setting it, I think useReducer, you would probably want to use useEffect to make network calls. I think useReducer is more so when you're managing multiple states that are all related to the same types of events. That's when you would do it. The same, it maps closely to how you would use useReducer in a Redux application. Yeah?
So obviously they're using the useReducer Redux syntax. Has that, I don't know if you've played around with it, has that lessened the use of your Redux, or do you think Redux still has a big part to play?
I have not started using this in my production applications yet. I would love to. But there's a lot of jokes floating around on the internet about this. And then suspense is another feature that React is coming out with that I have actually not dug into enough. But they're like, suspense is killing Redux, and Redux is getting the hook. And so a lot of people are kind of speculating that actually it may make Redux not really needed, which would be cool if we could have that all baked into React. That would be really powerful and great. So we'll see. Yeah.
So all of these hook, I guess, baked-in hooks that they have, they all start with use.
Mm-hmm.
Can I use the word use at the beginning of a function, or is React going to think that it's a hook?
I think if you're using the plugin, it would think it was a hook, but it wouldn't matter because it would lint it, but you're only going to get the linting errors if you're using state in ways that are not allowed. So it'll lint it, and it'll be like, yep, that didn't break the rules.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yeah?
I have a small comment. One thing that I've heard that people really like about useReducer versus useState is that because it's just very testable.
Mhm.
So it's a good thing to use, I guess.
Yeah.
State, but-
Yeah, it is. I love testing Redux. It is so easy. It's great. And that's one of the benefits that they were kind of talking about when they were introducing it, is just that the more that you're taking things, like it can be kind of hard to test class components sometimes when all these things are jumbled around together. And hooks let you really isolate things out by purpose, and it lets you break them down into really small pieces, and that is great from a testing perspective.
Where did you get the idea of using Moana for your?
Because Maui, actually, I am so sad because I messed up. I had a slide all prepared that was going to be really funny, where I was going to say, oh, that's right. Sorry, questions? It's because he has a magical hook that's like.
Why is that movie? I'm just curious. Where did it come from?
It's one of the best. My dad, upon walking out of that movie, like very somberly said, "Well, Disney's finally done it. They've made the perfect movie." So I'm a big Moana fan, so I guess that was my inspiration.
I like it.
Highly recommend it if you guys have not seen it. It's on Netflix, so. And this is probably copyright infringement. We can keep doing questions if people have more.
Oh, yeah. A few times.
All right. Oh, wait, yeah?
So, will you speak more on if you have use state, you can pull off the state that you want to store and update,
Mm-hmm.
as well as the second one is the function that will update it, right?
Yeah.
And that takes a single argument. And I've seen examples where it's like a counter, right? So
Yeah.
it takes state plus one to increment or whatever.
Yeah.
What is that second? What does that take as an argument? Can you pass a function in there? How do you update the state from that second?
So by default, use state, you're just passing in the new state. So with use, and it can be any, like we're used to with this .set state, state is always an object, right? But for use state, it can be a string, it can be an integer, it can be anything you want, basically. If you're going to use a custom hook, it doesn't only have to have one input. You could pass in begin date, end date. I'm just thinking of a network call that I was working on earlier today. But like you could pass in multiple parameters and then have your custom hook use those to come up with a new state based on that.
So use state is kind of saying that that's what the custom looks
Yeah, use state, whatever you pass it, it's just going to put that into the state variable. Versus with custom hook, the only thing that is constant about all custom hooks is that what you return is the new state. So whatever your custom hook outputs, that's the new state.
Any more questions before I start the clapping?
All right, so
Yeah. We can talk after.
Thank you so much, Rosie,
Yeah.
for that. If you guys want to hang out for a little bit, we're just going to be over there. Just grab a beer. Feel free to talk to us. If you have any other questions for Rosie, if you were hesitant to raise your hand because of the clap or something like that, just come out and talk to Rosie, and we'll be able to get those questions answered. So I hope you guys had a great time, and we'll be hanging out for about an hour or so before wrapping up. So again, thanks everyone.
Great.